Hello, I'm David D. Arment. We'll first be going over the history of cities by National Geographic. They state that cities originally grew around agricultural-based societies, so Mesopotamia, the Middle East in general, because the land in there where it's not just desert is largely fertile, and India, really just areas easily accessible to humanity. But of course, as humanity grew, we more began to place our cities along places that were better for trade. So oceans, rivers, ports, and as we continue, railroads and roads themselves. We then continue on to the history and importance of highways by traffic plan. They say that once the Industrial Revolution really kicked into high gear in the United States, and we got things such as rail and eventually cars, railroads and highways really grew, and now they're some of our most prominent and reliable sources of moving people and goods. Then we finally move on to the movie A Man with a Movie Camera. The movie itself doesn't really have any large cohesion, but instead just follows the course of your normal day. The intent of the movie, as stated in the original, was to be that it's a universal form of communication of cities and their general livelihood among all of humanity. And that is really, it stays true along the entire movie with only ideas of what city you're in through CCCP paraphernalia and the Cyrillic alphabet, assumably in Russian. The movie does a great job at presenting the truly universal culture of cities, despite the large discrepancy and culture of the countries themselves. Seems that cities have a very similar life no matter where you are, and that their growth and their population and the way they're built, of course, is more so a constant among humanity and not entirely based on what country they were actually based in.
After watching the YouTube video, How Are Cities Organized by the group known as CrashCourse on YouTube, it helped me understand why cities are organized in certain ways and how most models of cities can be predicted on how cities will grow. A point made in the video is that cities grow to the central business due to the central business districts. Therefore, inner cities are more densely populated compared to the outer surrounding areas. This reminded me about when we covered the topic of economic activity in class and how this draws in more people to the center of cities. Finally, I thought it was interesting at the end of the video when she said that the character of cities comes from the people who live in it because it needs to meet their social, physical, and spiritual needs. I haven't really thought about this before, but after reflecting on my personal experiences, I've noticed that each city I visited has had its own sort of personality. After reading The City and Its Elements by Kevin Lynch, this reading made me think of cities very differently. Some things that stood out to me was that when you grow up in certain places, you remember how to navigate and therefore have developed a sense of home and security. To connect to what we talked about in class, the reading said it's important for individuals to use their senses to understand the environment better and to feel more comfortable. We went in depth with this idea when we talked about the 5 senses known as sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch. I also thought it was interesting at the end when it talked about how cities are starting to be built more strategically after analyzing the current cities so they know what works for a dense population and what doesn't. I really enjoyed reading this because it gave me a new way to think about cities and how they truly make up everybody's experiences, whether they live in the city or if they're just visiting. An outside source, I decided to do a YouTube video called Urbanization and the Future of Cities by Ted Ed. This video talked about how we got to the present with about half of the world's population being located in urbanized cities. To get to this point, people started hunting and gathering and then settled down in towns after discovering the benefits of agriculture. Once the idea of new technologies began to surface, people now had a way to get from place to place and discovered trading, which brought more people together, which was the beginning of cities. This reminded me of when we talked about the early stages of cities, such as having a wall surrounding the city to keep people inside safe and unwanted people out. I thought this was a very informative video to help people understand how we got here. However, the ideas for the future could have been more descriptive as to how we will grow as a society. For example, how will it be possible to give every individual a good education, food, and sanitation when we can hardly do that today? If the population is to grow from 7 billion to 8 billion, we need more efficient plans for the future. I did, however, like that They said that we might need to start growing crops vertically because I've started to see this in some cities today.
In What is a City by Lewis Mumford, Mumford focuses primarily on the social means of a city, as that is what he believes city foundations should be based upon. The social nucleus, which includes government, education, the arts, social services, are what urban planners should focus on primarily when planning their city, instead of the physical means. And he believed that in his time, the 1930s, that is not what was happening. Mumford also believed that the size of a city must be proportional with how many people the social services and the social nucleus could support. In Lewis Wirth's article, Urbanism as a Way of Life, uh, Wirth goes over sociological relations to urbanism. He specifically talks about how the size of a population, how the density of a city, and how heterogeneity can kind of blur caste lines, create a mass society that is devoid of individualism. And although urbanites interact with one another far more than people in rural or suburban settings do, they experience higher rates of loneliness due to a mosaic of social worlds and a high fluidity in mobility, economically, and in social settings.
So in City and Metropolises, published in press books, they spoke on why we have cities, which is because of going from farming to industry, and this new technology and machinery made cities kind of established. They also spoke on why people like to live in cities, and that cities make wealth. Cities are efficient, efficiency creates wealth, and therefore people like to continue this and to continue to create and live with them. They also spoke on the push and pull factors for city, and those being incorporation, so to govern themselves, location, how close they are to goods, distance to other large cities, religion, so people wanting to gather in big religious areas like Mecca and Jerusalem, market and competition, so say industry, trade, jobs, and then distribution of goods, so like the Erie Canal and then big rivers were reasons for people to make cities in those locations to go ahead and distribute the goods that they were being made. They also spoke on theories for cities and kind of the geographical organization, so that being the central place theory, the law of the permanent city, and also reason for zoning, so kind of the grouping that goes along with the city planning system. So with all these things, we got a better understanding of kind of how cities were first started in American culture and the factors that resonated with their establishment. So in the 1939 documentary, The City, they paint this picture of how early American life is and how it has now changed. So how we started out as a very rural, handmade civilization, and then we now have the Industrial Revolution, where it's machines, fast rate, fast production, new jobs, the push for more and more all of a sudden, and then it's that real poor health quality, all the issues with the factory and all the labor bad conditions. So it kind of brings up this debate, which we now kind of see still for today, of what does America want its cities to become? Do we want this complete urbanism, or do we want more balance? Which I do think we see in a lot of cities today is a definite balance between having the CBD in some areas and then the suburbs to keep kind of the separate balance of work and play, profit and happiness, and a good distribution. So